If I asked you to picture a Gothic cathedral, you could probably give some general descriptions. Big, spiky, a lot of gray rocks. It's the style that roughly correlates to the Middle Ages, but if your knowledge of history is anything like mine, you pretty much think either now, Renaissance, and era of bad drawings. But I lucked out finding this book, which gave me a one-sentence definition of Gothic architecture on page 1. Quote, "The Gothic style evolved from the Romanesque church architecture when diagonal ribs were added to the groin vault. Any kind of arch which lies within the surfaces of a vault is called a rib." Oh, right, yeah. So, where's the ribs on this thing? While 3D artists could get great mileage studying the profiles of these different vaults, it's hard to assume that even the nerdiest of players would stare that hard at a video game ceiling. But the overall structure of these cathedrals creates a distinct flow of energy. The author of this text, Frankel, describes it as building through division, as in these huge open interiors are divided by arched diagonals crisscrossing overhead. Little monuments and props will have those same X shapes that could evoke any number of associations for us. And that building by division serves to differentiate this period from the prior one, the Romanesque, which used more square and sturdy forms for practical reasons, and when they needed to create drama, they would usually make something bigger or more repetitive. But this led to flat, arguably boring facades, kind of like your first Minecraft house. The more complex Gothic structures began construction around the end of the 11th century in France and neighboring territories, and it's likely that architects of buildings like this one learned their techniques from the glittering cities of the Byzantine Empire, a treasure trove of wealth and culture about to be ripped to shreds because some people called dibs on Jerusalem. Good thing that never happened again. Anyway, let's avoid that controversy and talk about the Catholic Church. The building itself is a symbol. If your glass is feeling half full, it symbolizes the labor of multiple generations pushing their craft to new heights and creating a testament to the glory of God. If your glass is feeling half empty, it's a new version of the pyramids where powerful oligarchs try to control the serfs by offering them shelter in a giant place where they could be intimidated en masse. And I should know because I was one of those people. I went to Notre Dame as an atheist teen and was absolutely awed into what is at least now a grudging respect. But however these symbolic structures were used by the people who own them, the structure itself is more than a big box. Those master builders might not have had to contend with electricity, but they did have to contend with the likes of the congestion which resulted on feast days when the faithful came to admire and worship the precious relics. The entrance to the Carolingian building, still standing at the time, was far too narrow, so the builder's first aim was to build a facade with 3 wide doorways. It was to have 2 towers, and between them and over the central doorway was to be a chamber, the camera, serving as a chapel, with 2 further chapels to the left and right of it at a slightly lower level. The inaccessibility of the central chapel suggests that it may also have served as a strong room for the safekeeping of treasures. And, again, even if you take the most cynical reading of those spaces as showrooms for demonstrations of power with secret treasure vaults, they survived even the countless wars and power struggles over the last 800 years. Enough people find something intrinsically moving in these places that they endure. And to me, it's that old comparison between those rib vaults and our own bones that stands out most clearly. Before buildings were structured around comfort or utilities, we had these pure expressions of strength with just enough ornament to remind us of the transcendent. And around the time these buildings were finally finished, some guy called Vlad started impaling, Bram Stoker wrote about vampires, and bing bang boom, Gothic culture is encapsulated in Castlevania. The early pixel art was rough and abstract, but for 1986, there's some evocative detail work, like this heavy drapery, which would have been essential to keep any building warm before climate control. It lacks detail, but it has a powerful combination of rigidity and angularity. The latter it does with its signature staircases, which perfectly mirror those 45-degree angle ribs that cut through the heavy straight lines of a cathedral's columns and walls. But rigidity. How can a fully animated action game be rigid? Gothic art is stiff. It's not very appealing, and it's easy to dismiss paintings like these as primitive or unnatural compared to the paintings of the same Christian icons from periods that followed. But that's the tricky thing about Gothic art. I used to hate it, but I got the chance to visit a very small museum, which kept their halls dark and the works in these massive, heavy frames. And not to draw another comparison that overly romanticizes tube TVs, but the smallness of those 80s televisions informs the style of the games. It doesn't instantly turn their backgrounds into Hieronymus Bosch, but that small size and soft image made simpler animations a logical choice. Castlevania fans love to wax poetic about the jumping in those games, and they're right. Not only does it differentiate that game feel from the bouncy cartoon type of Mario, but it forces a constant choice in us between jumping or whipping each enemy. Not only does that give the action a more dramatic and lethal feel, that reinforces the character designs. The sprites here are taller, their faces obscured, emphasizing the costumes. The third game adds these portraits to the UI, which are tiny but evocative of Gothic portraiture's abstraction, the way they distort the human face into an expressive mask instead of idealizing it. Of the first three games, I think the very first has the best environment art. Each level has a clear interior design purpose, even if they're stretched out to side-scroller length. Simon's Quest and Dracula's Curse tried to take the action outside of the castle, which mostly devolved into muddy tree lines and vague caves. With Super Castlevania 4 came the leap to 16-bit graphics. That resulted in clearer environmental detail, accentuating details like the masonry of these windows, but the expanded color palette feels unfocused. It's hard to talk about color in Gothic painting because age has completely distorted them. That desaturated, sepia-tinged look has totally colored our perception of them now. Like, we all know Greek statues were painted, but how the ghostly pale look is the way we perceive them now. We like to think of a culture that ancient as a more spiritually pure people, even though they actually loved the same cheap, gaudy crap that we do. Likewise, Castlevania 4 added a lot of nice environmental background detail that Gothic art had, but the weird tinge to some of these greens makes it feel a little too alive. It's not quite as ghoulish as those early Castlevania games. The next major release, Rondo of Blood, was a triumph in style, and it did so in steering the series away from the Gothic roots. It was a change of pace that stuck around for good. Forgetting the roots of a video game series often elicits cries of betrayal. But here's why it worked so well. The culturally Gothic touchstones are still in place. The monsters are shadowy, the carvings are creepy, and the European real estate is spiky, but the detail work is completely different. Castlevania 4 tried to integrate nature, which came out pretty garish. Rondo of Blood leans into the more saturated tones of the mid-90s. The bright hues are a perfect fit with the sharp flares, high collars, and cufflinks of the more romantic period character designs. Instead of a Gothic cathedral, Dracula himself now lives in a Regency-style mansion with gilded accents. The series has moved on to a different time because vampires themselves are ageless, whether that's the 200-year-old Romanian Bohemian menacing the Englishman or the 200-year-old American menacing Kristen Stewart. It's more about the mood than the logistics. And that blending of period styles reaches its peak in Symphony of the Night. While the game contains enough anachronisms to give any real historian a migraine, the mood is perfect. It's in my personal pixel art Mount Rushmore. This game represents something of the end of an era. It brought 3D into the franchise, and even more controversially, tweening to the animation. Some of its effects look weird in the modern ports. The game is still a masterclass in cutting corners when needed and splurging on detail when it counts. Enough of these sprites are reused to make Morrigan blush, and the effects didn't look amazing on release either. Dracula's castle rises out of the mists of time, but includes a striking amount of heavy machinery, and the occasional background art that looks positively 20th century. But all of the shortcuts blend in once the action is moving, because the gameplay shifted from the heavy and ponderous Gothic-style platforming to a distinctly romantic love of exploration and adventure. The evolution of the series was a natural change, and the art itself continued to be Gothic adjacent, but the increasingly fast-paced action was far afield from those historic roots. It was another series that would pick up the torch and depict new halls of the sacred and sanguine. Building cathedrals is something we can't comprehend. Buildings appear and disappear every few years in cities now. Saying this one took centuries sounds impressive, like how saying 50 million light years sounds far. But I can't parse that, no more than I can parse the reality of From Software shipping 4 games in 5 years. And, not shovelware. They were, in fact, action games, so painstakingly made that they all courted Game of the Year status and still spark discussion a full decade later. And while it's incomprehensible that these games all turned out mostly good, we can still see easily where their artists prioritized things to maintain their sanity. The art of Bloodborne is a huge leap in detail and polish over Dark Souls, but both share the philosophy of doing more with less. No art is created for singular moments or cutscenes. Asset reuse is the order of the day in games, but to here it's taken to an extreme. And that's not just by making you backtrack or killing you over and over, like NES Castlevania did. Because most of its encounters are visible from a distance, you have all these natural incentives to pause and really look, searching for items or new angles of approach before you run in there. The lack of a map is annoying at first, but mapping out the area in your head rewards you with shortcuts, extra loot, efficient side questing. I respect Sekiro as a game, but I found its more elegant style ill-suited to this gameplay loop, because it makes the more artificially repetitive elements stick out. Bloodborne makes it work. It's funny how the old Castlevanias tried to mask their repetitive tile sets with palette swaps, because it just draws more attention to them. Meanwhile, Bloodborne's desaturated colors and real-time lighting make them look more like different buildings made by the same artisans with stones from the same quarry. When there is quiet time to take in a larger, more expansive scene, they make masterful use of scale and distance, in the same way that the Gothic cathedral is supposed to make you gaze in awe from all the way across town. The Soulsborne games have this weird charm of being ugly up close but full of awe-inspiring vistas, which is a completely practical use of 3D models. We scrutinize faces, but not so much buildings, so you model some cool structures, mix and match the spires and spikes on them, then scale them down and fill the skybox with them. It's clear that they built the game's whole world first, then crafted the story and tone to serve that. If this setting had more plot or characters, like Dragon Age, you'd be wondering how the hell any of them got around town or where they grew their food in this confusing street layout. But it's not a boots-on-the-ground type adventure. It's the witching hour, a dreamscape. What made the setting stick with me and feel more than superficial was its use of religion. This isn't a game about faith, it's an action game, but each character is largely defined by their faith, or lack thereof. The early townspeople bar their doors, apparently having given up and decided to party until they die, but your allies haven't. The heart of the game is the hunter's dream, which is technically a workshop, but it's made to look like a small chapel, and your ritual of strengthening yourself by holding hands has a quiet power. Instead of giving money to a merchant, you share blood in a literal communion. I was surprised to meet Alfred, a faithful paladin type who offers you help with no transaction to speak of. Then there's these side quests to bring people to Odin Chapel. At first I assumed it might be an escort mission with danger and a corresponding reward, but you just have to spend a little time going out of your way and then trust that the people will make it. Then when the first one does, that's it. Even the heroic main quest has shades of this. It's said that vanquishing the monsters will save the world, but the world itself and the people in it make that victory feel like a distant dream. It might be an object-oriented video game, but it complements the reverential imagery and actions with this through line of discipline and patience that complements it perfectly. Talking about architectural style as either prioritizing form or function is always a false dichotomy. Builders of anything achieve new imagery by working within their means to serve a human purpose, or as Frankel put it, to regard stylistic classification as conventional leads to superficiality. We are not trying to find comfortable divisions, but to find the essence of each individual work and its position on the ladder of development. The devs at FromSoft didn't have to contend with the laws of physics, but instead their own terrifying work schedule, and they tried to create a place for us that was both challenging and comforting to inhabit, making the most out of the least material possible. And this is no hackneyed romanticization of Japanese minimalism, because we're gonna cap this one off by talking about
Resident Evil.
Village first uses the imposing Gothic silhouette of its castle overhead, just as Castlevania used Dracula's. But now, with the magic of 3D having fully evolved, we can actually visit those battlements and see some amazing masonry detail on top. This boss fight got some criticism for feeling a bit flat, like you're just kind of taking pot shots at a character off in the distance. And you could argue that this visually arresting environment art is the cause. If it were a bit more simplified, then maybe this character could interact with it more. It's a give and take, which you could say about this game's art writ large. It's incredibly detailed and rendered in first person, but that leads to a lot of rooms that are pretty quiet, mostly key hunting and avoiding few enemies at a time. And the religious elements of the story fare no better. It's a simple, evil woman uses cult leader tactics to manipulate innocent townspeople. The interior of this castle really does have a life its own, despite its stillness. The game's marketing focused on the castle segment for obvious reasons. Once you're done hyperventilating over Dark Mother, the building itself is just as breathtaking. The most specific date we get for the castle is a file stating that the winemaking of it can be traced back as far as the 15th century, and the blocky battlements do look like earlier Gothic construction, while the topmost towers have spires that have vaguely later Gothic vibes. The interior design, however, has unquestionably evolved with its inhabitants. The lady of the house has spruced up the place with more modern touches, but her heart seems to be in the Baroque period. The standout features of Baroque castle interiors are pretty much everything we see in Resident Evil 4's castle. A wide variety of materials on display, all ornate and with general preference shown to organic shapes. But those Baroque stylings have so much detail that I'm deciding to call it here and tell you to stay tuned for the next video about them. If you watch this long, comment below with your favorite Leon Kennedy outfit, or tell me to skip ahead to brutalism already. Please, anything you write helps me defeat the nightmare machine.